Hey guys, tonight we wander into a world that smells faintly of wet straw, cold stone, and the uneasy anticipation of empty bellies. You trudge through a village where the frost hasn't yet melted, and every face you pass seems drawn a little thinner than yesterday. A little more worn by hunger, you probably won't survive this if you weren't already used to fighting for scraps. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, leave a comment with your location and what time it is where you are. Let's see which corner of the globe is joining us tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake to the familiar clatter of empty buckets and the hushed murmur of neighbors pressing against the door, hoping for a piece of bread that doesn't exist. The granary is bare. Even the sacks of oats, those reliable friends through winters past, are little more than brittle husks now. Outside, the wind moans through skeletal trees, carrying the faint scent of frozen soil that has yet to yield any promise of food. Your stomach twists, and you know this is only the beginning. Historians still argue whether the Great Famine of the 14th century was a series of bad harvests or a perfect storm of mismanagement and climate. But standing here, shoulder to shoulder with other weary villagers, the cause seems almost irrelevant. You just feel the absence. The first morning of a famine hits differently than a cold snap or a late frost. You notice things you'd normally ignore: the scratch of vermin in the granary walls, the way cats and dogs stalk the outskirts of the village for fallen scraps, and the bitter taste of water filtered through leaves to hide its murkiness. You drag yourself through a thin, damp mist that blankets the fields, remembering how just a season ago, these same plots were lush with barley and wheat, bending low under the weight of their grain. Now, only patches of frostbitten stubble remain, and you know there is no mercy in the soil this year. Families huddle together for warmth and strength. Your neighbor, old Marta, mutters about the cows that didn't calve and the goats that fell sick. You notice her hands, knotted with age and toil, twitching as if they can will a loaf of bread into existence. A quirky fact that always comes to mind: some peasants reportedly tried to mix cow dung with flour in sheer desperation. Historians still argue whether it was truly widespread or just exaggerated by chroniclers trying to shame the poor. You suppress a shiver, both at the thought and at the dampness clinging to your own tunic. You wander to the edge of the village where the well has begun to dry, and neighbors argue quietly over the last sip of water. Children cling to their mothers, bellies swollen from what little they've eaten, and eyes that seem to knowing for their age peer at you. You remind yourself to breathe, though each inhale tastes of frost and dread. In your pocket, a dried hunk of bread saved from yesterday seems heavier than a sack of coins, because it might be the only thing keeping your own stomach from turning itself inside out. The church bell tolls in the distance, a hollow sound that echoes off stone walls and empty fields. It's a signal that some villagers will pray, some will barter, and some will simply walk to the edge of sanity, trying to scrape together enough food to survive. The church often promises miracles, and in these hours, a flicker of hope feels almost edible. You notice the awkward hush as the local priest carries a loaf blessed for the infirm tiny crumbs of faith that might fill a belly but cannot mask the gnawing anxiety. You wonder if it's superstition or strategy. Historians still argue whether ecclesiastical support during famine genuinely alleviated hunger or merely maintained social control. In the early light, you stumble across a neighbor who has taken to eating raw roots and foraged herbs from the woods nearby. They grin at you, a little too wide, and offer a bitter-tasting sprig of nettle. You take it politely, chewing slowly, and find a strange satisfaction in the act of consuming something that doesn't taste like anything at all. The crunch reminds you that your jaw still works, that you still have hands to gather, that you are, for now, alive. There's a fringe claim that some desperate villagers would boil down tree bark into a paste to mix with water. Historians still argue whether this was a survival technique or a tale spun to shock city dwellers, but your stomach clenches at the thought of needing it. As the day stretches on, your routine becomes a ritual of survival. Check the granary. Scavenge the edges of the village and avoid confrontation with neighbors eyeing the same scraps. You pass by the blacksmith's forge, where sparks dance in the dim sun, and you briefly imagine hammering iron instead of gnawing roots, imagining that labor could somehow replace the emptiness inside. Hunger bends your thoughts into strange shapes. You remember the story of a farmer who supposedly tried to eat wallpaper paste during a famine. Historians still argue whether it was a real event or just a moralizing tale, but you can't help a grim smile at the sheer audacity of human desperation. By midday, you trudge toward the fields again, hoping that maybe, just maybe, a stubborn weed or a late carrot has survived under the frost. You notice the birds circling above, more daring than usual, scavenging through the bare patches of earth. You catch yourself thinking that the birds are lucky they eat, fly, and return without worry of a lord or tax collector breathing down their necks. Hunger has a way of equalizing perspective, teaching you that a crow might envy a human's crumb just as much as you envy a crow's freedom. As afternoon wanes, you retreat to your small home, where smoke curls from a chipped chimney and the faint aroma of burnt wood lingers. The children nap fitfully, mothers mutter reassurances, and you finally sit, pressing your palms against the cold, rough table. There's a strange camaraderie here in shared suffering, a bond of quiet endurance. You remember the peculiar practice you once heard about, where villagers would keep tiny bellies of fermented porridge just to keep a sense of routine. Historians still argue whether it was a practical rationing strategy or ritualistic comfort. You think it might just make sense? Ritual becomes survival when nothing else can. Evening comes, and with it, the dimming light of a pale sun filtered through clouds thick with frost. You watch shadows stretch across your walls, long and thin like your own patience. The hunger presses in at the edges of thought, whispering doubts about tomorrow, about the next loaf, the next field, the next human kindness. And yet, within the gnawing, you recognize a strange warmth, the resilience of bodies that bend but do not break, of communities that talk, barter, and console each other, even when there's no bread. You make a mental note that tomorrow you'll need to venture further, search harder, and perhaps make choices that will test the limits of what it means to survive. Night falls slowly, carrying the scent of frozen earth and the quiet stir of restless villagers. You lie down on a thin straw mattress, listening to the faint crackle of the fire and the occasional cough from the corner of the room. Hunger hums in your veins, a persistent reminder that this is just the first day of many. Yet, as your eyelids grow heavy, a tiny spark of pride glows. You endured today. You scavenged, observed, and strategized. You are still part of the story, still present in a world that is testing you at every turn. You drift toward sleep with that uneasy companionship of famine, fear, and ingenuity intertwined. And as dreams begin to blur the edges of your reality, you hold on to the faint hope that the days ahead might offer food, laughter, and maybe even a story worth telling around the hearth. If only you survive long enough to tell it. Remember this feeling, the cold, the empty stomach, and the determination, because tomorrow the forest awaits. The next morning, you rise before dawn, pulling your thin cloak tighter against a wind that smells of wet leaves and frost. You step out onto the village's muddy path, careful to avoid puddles that might soak your feet. Every sound is amplified in this quiet, desperate hour. The distant clop of a horse, the scrape of a cartwheel over frozen soil, the occasional caw of a crow searching for its own breakfast. Hunger has sharpened your senses. Each sniff of smoke or whiff of damp earth carries a promise or a threat. Today, you are no longer confined to the bare village square. You need the woods. It's the forgotten woods, the tangled undergrowth that might, if you are clever and lucky, yield sustenance. The forest edges look menacing in the low morning light, gnarled branches scratching at the fog as though warning you to turn back. You remind yourself that countless villagers before you have done this, and survived or, at least, lasted long enough to tell the tale. Foraging is more than just finding food. It's a test of patience and observation. You crouch over a patch of moss, gently parting leaves, and discover small roots and tubers. The earth is cold and wet, but you pry a handful free, inhaling the earthy scent, a humble reward for your effort. You chew slowly, the bitterness of the raw root reminding you that survival is rarely sweet. A quirky tidbit that sometimes surfaces in old accounts. Some peasants claim that the roots of certain mushrooms could cure fatigue, but only after being boiled in an elaborate ritual. Historians still argue whether this was medicinal advice or superstition disguised as survival technique. You shake your head and chuckle quietly at the thought. As you push deeper into the woods, the landscape changes. Twisting branches form archways overhead, and the mud becomes a slick canvas underfoot. You spot a cluster of acorns, some gnawed by squirrels, some untouched. The temptation is immediate. Gather them, dry them, perhaps grind them into a coarse flour. You know that acorns contain tannins, which are bitter and can irritate the stomach if eaten raw. But desperate people have found ways to leach them in running water or boil them in repeated cycles. You find a small stream and dunk a handful of acorns, feeling the cold bite your fingers as you kneel in the icy water. Survival, you remind yourself, is often about ritualized labor as much as cleverness. You notice the sound of twigs snapping underfoot and freeze. A deer bounds between the trees, graceful yet wary. Hunger sharpens your envy and your awareness simultaneously. You cannot catch it. Not today, but observing its careful movements teaches you something about patience. In a fringe account, some villagers are said to have tried luring deer with baskets of flour mixed with herbs. A strategy that may or may not have actually worked. Historians still argue whether these reports were fact or imaginative storytelling by chroniclers. Regardless, you take note of the idea, filing it away in your mental toolkit. Deeper into the forest, you find nettles. Their green leaves prickly and potent. Cooking them will remove the sting, but for now, you pick them carefully. Careful not to bleed onto the already meager meal you carry in your satchel. You remember old stories about peasants who used nettle tea to stave off hunger pangs and even boost energy, though some claim it was mostly placebo. You smile faintly. Any excuse to sip a bitter infusion that vaguely resembles soup is a gift right now. You move on, crouching under low-hanging branches, stepping over fallen logs that smell of damp decay. The forest is alive. Birds peck at the ground. Insects hum in a faint rhythm. And somewhere, a fox snuffles through leaves. You realize that the woods are a world unto themselves, indifferent to human need. Yet, in this indifference, there is opportunity. You notice wild garlic peeking through the frost, and your stomach flutters in anticipation. The sharp scent promises flavor, even if it cannot replace bread. A strange survival fact surfaces. Some desperate peasants reportedly ate the innermost bark of young trees. Historians still argue whether this was widespread or simply a cautionary tale for city dwellers. You nibble a thin sliver of garlic, the pungency biting your tongue, and feel strangely invigorated. Hours pass, and the rhythm of foraging settles in. You begin to recognize patterns. Where moss thrives, roots are likely. Where the soil is loose, small tubers hide. Under fallen branches, edible mushrooms may linger, but some are deadly. You tread carefully, mindful of the consequences. The margin between nourishment and poison is thin, and you are painfully aware that a single mistake could undo all your careful planning. Survival is as much a game of knowledge as it is of effort. Midday brings sunlight filtering through the canopy, slanting across the forest floor in golden beams. You pause to catch your breath, resting on a mossy log and surveying your modest bounty. A handful of roots, acorns soaked and partially peeled, some bitter leaves, and a few mushrooms you have identified as safe. You marvel at how resourceful you have become in so little time. The forest has taught you more in a few hours than the village could have in weeks, yet a gnawing anxiety persists. You know the yield is enough for a single meal, perhaps two if rationed, and the day is far from over. Your thoughts drift to fringe stories you've overheard. One villager swore that boiling nettle with oak bark would create a kind of stew that could fool the stomach into feeling full. You hesitate, weighing practicality against desperation. Historians still argue whether these culinary experiments were common or exaggerated in tales meant to illustrate ingenuity. Curiosity gets the better of you, and you pocket a small amount of oak bark, thinking you might test it later. Every choice now feels like a gamble, and yet, each gamble carries the tiny hope of nourishment. By late afternoon, you shift your focus from gathering to safety. Shadows lengthen, and the forest becomes a maze of grays and blacks. You hear the distant bark of a dog or wolf, sometimes difficult to distinguish in the quiet. You stick to paths you recognize, marking your route with subtle scratches on tree bark. A light joke crosses your mind. If I survive the famine, maybe I can start a forest GPS service. You chuckle softly. Humor is a small shield against despair. Eventually, you begin the trek back to the village, satchel heavier but still modest. The forest seems different in reverse, each tree a looming sentinel, each sound magnified. You notice the delicate frost-coating fallen leaves, the tiny footprints of animals skittering across the soil. Your stomach rumbles, and you remind yourself that this is only a temporary reprieve. Hunger will return with the next sunrise, perhaps sooner, and you must be ready. Back at the village edge, you pause to observe your neighbors. Some have ventured similarly, returning with meager offerings, others remain inside, too afraid or weak to try. The village breathes in collective exhaustion. You catch sight of a small group boiling water over an open fire, tossing in roots and leaves you recognize. The scent is bitter, but somehow comforting, the first communal meal of the season. A quirky note surfaces. Some villagers once added crushed snail shells to stew for calcium. Historians still argue whether this was survival strategy or nutritional superstition, but you find yourself silently admiring human creativity under pressure. Night approaches, and the village readies itself for another long evening. Fires flicker in small homes, and you share a quiet meal with neighbors, the forest bounty distributed and appreciated. You notice subtle signs of resilience, a child giggling over the smallest taste of acorn porridge, an elder offering sage advice on what leaves are edible, a quiet nod of acknowledgement when someone has found mushrooms first. These small gestures reinforce the fragile threads of community that famine cannot entirely sever. As you lie down that night, satchel empty, but spirit slightly fuller, you replay the day's lessons. The forest is both friend and adversary, offering sustenance but demanding caution, observation, and patience. You understand, more than ever, the delicate balance of survival, the need to act quickly, yet wisely, to trust instincts, yet respect nature's hazards. Hunger is relentless, but you are learning, adapting, and enduring. And as sleep finally draws you under, you feel the subtle satisfaction of a day survived, of knowledge gained, and of the quiet triumph that comes with understanding the rhythms of the woods. Tomorrow, you will rise again, with the forest waiting to teach you more secrets of survival. And perhaps, if fortune favors, bring you closer to sustaining life rather than merely clinging to it. Dawn creeps over the village, spilling pale light across frost-lined roofs and muddy paths. And you awaken to a stomach that seems to have grown sharper overnight, gnawing at you insistently. Today, your plan is audacious. You experiment with the strange ingredients that have been accumulating from your forest foraging, attempting to turn bitterness into sustenance. Hunger has long since rewritten the rules of what you consider edible, and the line between survival and culinary adventure is blurrier than ever. You trudge to the small hearth in your home, your hands already twitching with anticipation and anxiety. You set a pot of water over the fire, listening to the wood hiss and crackle as the heat spreads. You drop in the first handful of nettles, careful not to burn yourself on their prickly leaves. The scent is earthy, sharp, almost medicinal, and you inhale cautiously, imagining it might invigorate your sluggish body. You remember the advice from an elder who swore that boiling nettles 3 times would remove both sting. And bitterness historians still argue whether this method was widely practiced or simply an oral legend, but you follow it nonetheless. Every bubble in the pot feels like a small triumph, each hiss a reassurance that the day will not be entirely consumed by emptiness. Next, you add a handful of roots, thin knobby things that smell faintly of dirt and damp stone. You scrub them as best you can, but there is only so much cleanliness achievable in a famine-stricken household. As they boil, you realize the rhythm of cooking is oddly calming. The steady bubbling, the faint aroma, the warmth radiating from the hearth. In a fringe account, you once overheard villagers would boil roots with bits of bark, believing the combination would trick the stomach into thinking it's full. Historians still argue whether this was actual practice or a story meant to entertain city scribes, but the idea sparks a cautious grin. You add a thin strip of oak bark, mostly for morale. While the concoction simmers, you begin to notice the sensory details around you. The chill of the morning seeping through the mud-caked door. The distant crowing of roosters. The occasional scrape of carts moving over frozen ruts. Hunger heightens awareness, and even small sounds, the crack of a branch outside, the hiss of the fire feel amplified. You stir the pot, inhaling deeply, and convince yourself that aroma itself can be a form of nourishment. After all, the body remembers flavors long before it tastes them. You decide to add a few mushrooms that you recognized as safe from yesterday's foraging. Their earthy, faintly metallic scent mixes with the nettles and roots, creating a strange, unidentifiable aroma. You slice them thinly, listening to the delicate snap and imagining the nutrients waiting within. A light joke flits through your mind. If this kills me, at least I'll have died tasting something exotic. You chuckle softly. Humor is a necessary shield against despair. Boiling these strange ingredients takes hours, more than you anticipated. You stir, check, taste cautiously, and adjust the proportions as best you can, developing a primitive intuition about flavor and safety. In the process, you recall tales of peasants who used to make broth from tree bark, alone claiming it sustained them during long winters. Historians still argue whether such recipes were common survival strategies or later exaggerations, but you consider trying it if all else fails. For now, the nettle and root concoction seems safer. As the morning stretches into noon, the forest outside provides intermittent visitors, birds swooping for seeds, a fox's cautious peek from behind a tree, even a wandering goat searching for grass patches. You marvel at their persistence, noting that survival is not unique to humans, it is shared across species. You imagine that perhaps this is the ultimate lesson of famine: awareness, adaptation, and a willingness to experiment. Fringe tales suggest some villagers even added tiny amounts of crushed snail shells to their stews to enrich the broth. Historians still argue whether this was nutritional wisdom or imaginative storytelling, but you ponder it curiously, knowing that desperation drives creativity. By afternoon, the strange stew begins to smell almost palatable, and you ladle a small portion into a bowl. You sit cross-legged on the cold floor, spoon trembling slightly as you lift the first bite. The texture is gritty, the flavors sharp and unexpected, but it fills a hollow space in your stomach that has been gnawing relentlessly. You close your eyes and savor the sensation, however brief, that perhaps, just perhaps, ingenuity can indeed stave off hunger. Midway through the meal, you notice the subtle dynamics of your household. Children nibble cautiously, elders watch with wary approval, and even the dog, usually uninterested in your culinary experiments, licks at the pot's edge. Hunger has a way of equalizing priorities. No one criticizes, no one scoffs. The stew is a shared triumph, a testament to human creativity under pressure. You reflect on the fact that survival often relies not just on skill, but on morale. A full belly, even partially, sustains more than the body sustains hope. While eating, your mind drifts to historical comparisons. You imagine peasants during the Great Famine boiling leaves, roots, and anything vaguely edible in a similar fashion, negotiating with taste and safety. The process is a delicate dance. Add too much bark, and the meal becomes inedible. Too little, and the stomach remains unsatisfied. You chuckle at the absurdity. Imagine if someone handed me a menu of oak bark and nettles and called it haute cuisine. But humor softens the tension, making the ordeal more bearable. By late afternoon, you set aside the nearly finished stew, allowing your belly to digest slowly. You step outside, taking in the shifting light, the muted hum of the village settling into evening. The world seems simultaneously bleak and beautiful. Frost glittering on stubble, distant smoke curling from chimneys, and the faint laughter of children as they chase one another, momentarily forgetting hunger. You remind yourself that this is a fragile equilibrium. Famine has a habit of disrupting even the smallest joys. You wander to the edge of the forest once more, considering a brief scouting mission for fresh herbs or roots. The light has softened, the air cool and clean, and the forest seems less threatening than it did in the morning. You notice patches of wild garlic and tiny shoots breaking through the frost. Hunger sharpens your eye, but now you approach with a combination of caution and knowledge. You recognize safe plants, avoid the dangerous ones, and mentally tally potential meals for the days ahead. Fringe accounts mention villagers mixing certain wild herbs with acorns to make a more digestible paste. Historians still argue whether these were genuine survival strategies or embellishments, but you consider testing it carefully tomorrow. As the sun dips below the horizon, casting long shadows across the village, you return home. The stew pot is nearly empty, yet your spirit feels replenished. You recognize a subtle rhythm forming: forage, experiment, share, rest, repeat. Survival is not a matter of heroic feats, but of patience, observation, and small triumphs. You remind yourself that the day's efforts, though exhausting, have provided sustenance, morale, and a deeper understanding of the fragile ecosystem you inhabit. Nightfall brings silence, broken only by the occasional cough, the rustle of animals in the distance, and the faint crackle of dying embers in the hearth. You lie down on your straw mattress, stomach warm but still aware of the lurking emptiness, and reflect on the day's lessons. The strange stew, the rituals of preparation. The cautious foraging, all of it has reinforced a simple truth. Ingenuity is as critical as physical strength in surviving famine. As sleep approaches, you think of tomorrow, of continued experiments, and of the forest's patient instruction. You drift into dreams flavored with earthy aromas, bitter roots, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that despite scarcity, human resourcefulness has carried you through another day. You remind yourself that each day survived is both victory and preparation, a step closer to enduring the famine without surrender. You awake to the distant toll of the village bell, its hollow clangs vibrating through the frost-chilled air and reminding you that faith and survival are often tangled together in ways you are only beginning to understand. Today, the forest and the stew have sustained your body, but the mind seeks nourishment too, and there is a growing awareness that hunger stretches beyond empty stomachs, tests loyalties, ethics, and the very structure of the village. You trudge toward the small chapel, drawn by the hope that prayers, relics, or the faint promise of divine intervention might yield more than spiritual comfort. The chapel's wooden doors creak as you enter, carrying the smell of tallow candles, cold stone, and faint incense. The air is thick with the murmurs of villagers offering petitions, quietly bargaining with the unseen and holding onto scraps of hope as tightly as they hold their rationed bread. You watch as a mother places a coin at the foot of a statue, whispering a plea for her children's health. You notice that even faith has become a form of currency, something to be negotiated, exchanged, or leveraged. Historians still argue whether medieval religious rituals genuinely alleviated hunger or merely provided psychological comfort. But you can feel the tension between hope and necessity vibrating in the chapel walls. You wander past flickering candles and kneeling figures, observing subtle interactions. An elder hands a blessed loaf to a child, insisting it will carry protection beyond mere nourishment. You take in the mixture of reverence and pragmatism. Faith and survival coexist, awkwardly entwined. A fringe tale whispers that some villagers attempted to bribe local priests with small tokens or labor in exchange for extra rations or blessings. That might translate to physical sustenance. Historians still argue whether such transactions were rare acts of cunning or exaggerated rumors, but the story lingers in your mind, highlighting how necessity stretches morality. As you leave the chapel, you step onto a frost-tinged path where villagers barter quietly. The market is subdued, survival masquerading as trade. You notice old Marta whispering to a neighbor, exchanging a small bundle of nettles for a handful of grain she's managed to hoard. You realize that desperation sharpens negotiation skills in a way no teacher could replicate. You remember a quirky anecdote. During some famines, clergy were said to weigh relics against grain, signing value in an almost absurd equivalence of spiritual versus physical sustenance. Historians still argue whether these were symbolic acts or pragmatic measures, but you can't help but marvel at human ingenuity under pressure. You continue through the square, observing subtle hierarchies and social dynamics. The Lord's men patrol discreetly, measuring the line between enforcement and empathy. Grain is scarce, and bread is power. One misstep, a too-bold barter, a suspected theft could lead to punishment. Reminding you that survival is not merely a matter of stomach and skill, but of careful calculation and timing. A faint joke creeps into your thoughts. Better not sneeze wrong near the granary, or I might be garnished with it myself. You chuckle softly, the absurdity a thin veil over the very real danger. By midday, you notice the church offering small distributions of bread to the sick and elderly. The ration is minuscule, barely enough to keep hunger from gnawing too fiercely, but it carries weight far beyond its physical size. Observing, you see how faith, hierarchy, and survival intersect in curious ways. Prayers for rain might be whispered over a handful of dough. Blessings are weighed in ounces of grain. Fringe accounts mention villagers keeping tiny prayer books tucked with rationed food, believing spiritual fortification would enhance nutritional effect. Historians still argue whether this was widely practiced or a localized superstition, but the practice reflects the intertwining of hope, necessity, and creativity. You wander to the outskirts where the poorest dwellings crowd together near the edge of the village. Here, survival strategies are overt, direct, and sometimes morally ambiguous. Children scavenge for roots, elders barter tools for tiny amounts of flour, and every action is measured against the invisible clock of hunger. You recall that stealing from a neighbor was technically a crime punishable by mutilation or imprisonment, yet desperation often bends law in subtle ways. You weigh the ethical landscape, realizing that famine forces recalibration of every societal rule. As afternoon wanes, you find yourself observing a particularly striking tableau: a young couple sharing a morsel of bread under a thin roof, whispering reassurance and dividing it evenly despite the gnawing pangs in their own bellies. Hunger has a way of sharpening both altruism and cunning. A fringe account suggests that some villagers would feign illness to receive charity. A survival tactic often frowned upon, yet difficult to condemn under the circumstances. Historians still argue whether such behavior was a coping strategy or moral failing, but you recognize the adaptability of human behavior in crisis. The evening draws a muted haze across the village. Fires flicker weakly in chimneys, the smoke carrying both warmth and the faint aroma of burnt wood. You settle near the central hearth, the community's energy quiet but palpable. Conversations are low, deliberate, a mix of planning, gossip, and moral debate. You notice that people no longer talk about abundance. Instead, their dialogue revolves around scarcity, timing, and careful allocation. Hunger has rewritten the social script, teaching subtleties of negotiation, restraint, and observation. As darkness settles, you take a quiet moment to reflect on the day. The chapel, the bartering. The subtle interplay of faith and desperation all have reinforced a lesson. Survival is rarely a matter of brute force alone. Knowledge, awareness, and social skill are equally critical. You recall a fringe tidbit about villagers using small charms or amulets to bring luck in acquiring food. Historians still argue whether these were genuinely believed or simply a psychological comfort. But you can see how even small rituals provide reassurance in a world governed by uncertainty. Finally, you return home. Your steps slow but deliberate. You sit by the fire, tasting the small morsels you've acquired through negotiation, observing the flicker of light on the walls and noting the quiet resilience in your neighbor's eyes. Hunger has reshaped the village, forcing people to adapt, barter, and rely on both ingenuity and faith. And yet, amidst the strain, there is an unspoken thread of community, a shared commitment to endure together. You lie down that night, body tired, mind contemplative. You reflect on the strange alchemy of survival, the interplay of skill, belief, social awareness, and daring experimentation. Hunger may drive despair, but it also sharpens intelligence, creativity, and observation. As sleep draws near, you feel the faint reassurance that even in scarcity, resourcefulness, faith, and solidarity provide sustenance beyond the belly. The village sleeps quietly, each hearth a small bastion against the creeping threat of famine. And you drift into dreams that carry lessons for tomorrow, lessons about negotiation, observation, and the curious marriage of faith and morning arrives with a brittle chill, and you trudge once again into the world reshaped by hunger. This time acutely aware of the invisible hierarchies that determine who eats and who waits. The Lord's Manor rises above the village, a stern silhouette of stone and timber, windows glinting in the pale sun. You know that bread, grain, and any hope of surplus lie within those walls, guarded by men who measure loyalty and desperation with equal precision. Today, survival is not only about foraging and cooking, it is about navigating authority, power, and law in a world stripped to essentials. You move carefully along the muddy lanes, keeping to shadows when possible, observing patterns. Villagers whisper of punishments for even the smallest transgressions. Stealing a loaf could cost a hand, or worse, public humiliation. Hunger presses against your resolve, and you realize that every decision is now a balance between necessity and risk. Historians still argue whether feudal enforcement during famines leaned more toward deterrence or oppression. But standing here, you can feel the weight of authority like a stone on your chest. A small market lies near the manor gates, quiet yet tense. Merchants and peasants alike move in hushed calculation. You watch as a neighbor nervously offers a few dried mushrooms in exchange for grain. The transaction performed under the Lord's watchful eyes. Every handshake, every measured word is a negotiation in survival. You recall quirky accounts of villagers paying in labor or strange items like painted pebbles or unused tools to gain access to rations. Historians still argue whether this was widespread practice or anecdotal exaggeration, but today it feels like an inevitable reality. You spot a group of men hauling grain sacks toward the Lord's granary. The sheer volume, more than your entire village consumes in months, strikes you with both awe and resentment. Hunger distorts perspective. You see abundance, yet cannot touch it, and it sharpens both caution and cunning. A faint joke surfaces. Maybe if I bow properly, they'll lend me a handful of luck instead of flour. Humor is a small but vital reprieve from constant calculation. You notice the interplay of law and survival everywhere. The Lord's bailiff patrols discreetly, eyes sharp, hands resting near weapons, but also keeping an ear tuned to whispers of barter, theft, or dissent. You realize that understanding local laws, customs, and tolerated behaviors is as essential as knowing edible plants or recipes. Fringe accounts tell of villagers leaving small offerings at manor gates to avoid punishment or curry favor. A mix of superstition and strategy. Historians still argue whether these gestures genuinely influenced outcomes or were mostly symbolic, but you take mental notes for possible application. Walking past a field stripped bare by frost and feudal demands. You see neighbors attempting covertly to gather roots and leftover grains, balancing between hunger and fear. You notice subtle cues, glances, hesitations, and small signs of complicity. Hunger has sharpened your observational skills. Every human action carries potential information, threat, or opportunity. You remember an old story of a villager using clever distraction to secure a sack of grain. A blend of daring and audacity. Historians still argue whether such tales are literal truth or cautionary embellishments, but today you appreciate the lesson of ingenuity under duress. By midday, you find yourself at the edge of a small commons area near the manor. There, a few villagers have quietly set up makeshift exchanges. Dried roots for a bit of flour, nettles for tiny scraps of cheese. You note how social intelligence and careful negotiation supplement physical endurance. Hunger is a teacher that disciplines both body and mind. You recognize a subtle pattern. Those most adept at reading human behavior often secure slightly better rations. Their eyes sharp, their voices measured, their patience near infinite. A striking moment occurs when a young boy approaches the manor gates, holding out a few stolen nuts, offering them to a guard with a polite bow. The guard glances, shrugs, and allows him passage to the edge of the grain store, a tiny exception in a rigid hierarchy. You witness the tension between law and survival firsthand. Discretion sometimes outweighs codified rules. Fringe anecdotes speak of guards accepting odd bribes or favors during famine seasons. Historians still argue whether this was a systemic approach or occasional. Leniency, but you can see its practical relevance. Late afternoon finds you back among the village homes, observing how hunger subtly reshapes domestic life. Some families ration meticulously, hiding grains in unusual places. Others trade small luxuries, like herbs or scraps, for minor sustenance. You notice the psychological dimension. People hoard not only for the body, but for security and control. Survival now blends physical endurance with cunning, timing, and moral flexibility. A small joke flits through your mind. I'd better hide my soup before someone negotiates it into oblivion. You chuckle softly. Humor remains a fragile shield. As evening settles, you gather with neighbors near the communal hearth. Discussions revolve around rationing, bartering, and occasional tales of minor victories or failures from the manor. Hunger has forged a community of shared struggle, and you appreciate the subtle bonds forming in adversity. People whisper advice, share small morsels, and watch each other's actions for clues about strategy and safety. Even amid fear, collaboration persists, a testament to human adaptability. You sit by the fire, tasting a small ration of bread carefully saved from earlier trades. Each bite is deliberate, each chew a reminder that survival is not passive. Hunger demands engagement, attention to environment, careful social navigation, and strategic thought. You reflect on the day's lessons, understanding hierarchy, negotiating under scrutiny, observing behavior, and leveraging creativity. Fringe tales remind you that some villagers feigned illness to obtain extra bread, a moral gray area, complicated by survival imperatives. Historians still argue whether such deception was common or exceptional, but the principle resonates. Night falls, and the village settles into quiet tension. Each hearth flickers against the dark, a fragile bastion against scarcity. You lie on your straw mattress, body weary, mind alert with new knowledge of feudal dynamics and subtle survival strategies. Hunger has become more than appetite. It is awareness, adaptation, and cautious negotiation. As sleep approaches, you contemplate the delicate balance between law, power, and sustenance. You drift into dreams of quiet triumphs and small victories. Aware that each day survived under the watchful eyes of lords and laws strengthens not just your body, but your understanding of human cunning and endurance. You wake before dawn once again, the cold seeping through your thin blanket, and feel the persistent ache of emptiness in your stomach. Today, hunger is no longer abstract. It is tangible, a constant pressure that reshapes your senses and thoughts. As you step into the village square, the soft murmur of your neighbors reminds you that everyone is navigating the same invisible currents of desperation. The hearths flicker dimly, smoke curling into the chilly morning air. And you realize that famine reshapes not just bellies, but the bonds between people. Families huddle together, exchanging whispered strategies and warnings. You notice that laughter is quieter now. Cautious, measured its presence, a fragile thread holding the community together. Children glance at your direction, hoping for guidance or reassurance. And elders cast a wary eye over everyone, silently judging, advising, and guarding. Hunger has a way of magnifying both tenderness and suspicion. Historians still argue whether famine primarily strengthened village solidarity or exacerbated isolation and distrust. But standing here, you see both forces at play in a delicate balance. You wander past a row of cottages where small gardens have withered, leaving only frostbitten stems and soil cracked by cold. Neighbors discreetly scrape together whatever scraps remain, hiding tiny rewards for their families. You notice that subtle ingenuity thrives in these constrained spaces. A cleverly dug hole to preserve roots, a cloth covering a small stash of grain, or a hidden cache of acorns tucked beneath stones. A quirky anecdote comes to mind. Some peasants reportedly buried small amounts of flour in the ground, believing that soil would protect it until needed. Historians still argue whether this was practical or symbolic, but it demonstrates the lengths to which people went to safeguard survival. By mid-morning, you make your way to a small communal area where villagers have gathered. Sharing information about the dwindling resources, conversations are low, cautious, but you overhear tips on foraging, barter, and survival techniques. You exchange a nod with a neighbor who has found edible moss along a shaded stream bank. You recall that moss contains minimal nutrients, yet in a pinch, it can supplement other foods. Fringe accounts suggest that moss was sometimes mixed with water and roots to form a crude porridge. Historians still argue whether this was widely practiced or merely anecdotal, but you consider it worth noting. As the day progresses, hunger's impact becomes more apparent. You notice subtle changes in behavior. Neighbors hoard more visibly. Glances linger a fraction too long, and children are increasingly quiet, conserving energy rather than play. You recognize that famine reshapes daily rhythms, forcing people to adapt not only physically but socially. A faint joke crosses your mind. At this rate, even gossip is rationed. Humor offers a small reprieve, a mental shield against the gnawing anxiety of scarcity. You wander past the village smithy, where the air smells faintly of smoke and hot iron, and observe how work has slowed. Tools lie unused, and the forge's rhythm is irregular. Energy is conserved where possible. Hunger is not merely a physical challenge, but a force that redirects every activity toward efficiency and necessity. You pause, realizing that survival is measured not only by what is eaten, but by how the community preserves strength and resources. Midday finds you visiting neighbors who are experimenting with unconventional foods. One woman offers you a small portion of fermented porridge, a mixture of soaked acorns, herbs, and a hint of barley. The taste is bitter, the texture coarse, yet it provides both calories and warmth. You note how experimentation has become a communal effort. Knowledge is shared discreetly to maximize survival. Fringe accounts suggest that some villagers added tree bark to porridge for fiber. Historians still argue whether this was standard practice or anecdotal, but the principle is clear. Innovation is a necessary ally in famine. As afternoon wanes, the village atmosphere shifts subtly. The quiet anxiety of the morning gives way to a tense cooperation. Shared labor, discreet trades, and mutual vigilance. You observe how families ration carefully, dividing morsels. And even tiny victories, like a found tuber or a handful of acorns, become reasons for quiet celebration. Hunger molds human behavior in nuanced ways, fostering collaboration and mistrust simultaneously. You stroll past the edge of a frost-bitten field, noting the sparse growth that stubbornly resists the cold. A neighbor is foraging for wild greens, using knowledge passed down through generations. You recognize the value of such expertise. It is not only food that is at stake, but survival through accumulated understanding. A quirky tidbit surfaces. During some famines, peasants reportedly believed that singing to certain plants encouraged growth. Historians still argue whether this was ritualistic or practical, but it illustrates the human attempt to influence nature even in desperate times. By late afternoon, you return home with a small bounty of roots, moss, and a handful of acorns. The cumulative effort of the day leaves your body weary, but your mind is sharper, attuned to patterns of scarcity, generosity, and risk. You prepare a modest meal, boiling roots and herbs together, the aroma both bitter and oddly comforting. Sitting by the fire, you savor each bite, conscious that it represents hours of observation, negotiation, and physical effort. Evening arrives quietly, the village settling under a gray sky. You watch as neighbors share the last scraps of food, exchange tips for tomorrow, and sit near fires that offer warmth and light. Hunger has reshaped the social fabric, forcing people to observe, communicate, and adapt continuously. You reflect on the day's lessons. Endurance is necessary, but so is attention to human behavior. The clever management of resources and the willingness to share knowledge discreetly. As night falls, you lie on your straw mattress, your stomach modestly full, body tired, and mind alive with observation. You feel the subtle reassurance that, despite scarcity, the village is resilient. Hunger has transformed daily life, reshaped relationships, and taught lessons that extend beyond simple survival. As sleep approaches, you allow yourself to drift, holding on to the hope that tomorrow will bring continued adaptation. Small victories, and perhaps a touch of comfort amidst the relentless challenge of famine. The next morning dawns gray and brittle, frost coating the village rooftops and the thin fields that have stubbornly resisted the season. You rise, muscles stiff from the cold and hunger, but a faint determination warms your spirit. Today, your focus shifts to water, not just as hydration, but as a crucial resource for survival. Streams, wells, and even rainwater have become treasures. And you know that managing water carefully can mean the difference between endurance and collapse. You trudge toward the nearest well, mindful of the uneven mud and ice, aware that every step might carry risk. The well stands quietly, its stone edges cold and damp, moss curling along the cracks. A few villagers are gathered nearby, filling jugs slowly, quietly, each exchange measured to avoid dispute. You notice subtle hierarchies. Who arrives first? Who knows the proper technique to draw water efficiently? Who commands patience from others with a nod or a glance? Hunger and scarcity have sharpened social navigation into an essential survival skill. Historians still argue whether water management during medieval famines was centralized or primarily improvised by local communities. But standing here, you see a blend of both approaches. You lower your bucket, feeling the chill bite at your hands, and draw up a portion of clear, icy water. Even a small splash is invigorating. You sip slowly, savoring the taste, aware that water is as essential as food, and that its absence would quickly undo all other efforts. A quirky account floats to mind. Some villagers reportedly flavored their water with herbs or even tree bark to disguise stagnation or enhance preservation. Historians still argue whether this was widespread practice or occasional ingenuity, but today it sparks a practical idea for improving flavor and morale. After securing a small supply, you venture toward a thin strip of woodland where other villagers forage. Roots, leaves, and any remaining edible growth are precious commodities. You notice signs of foraging from previous days: disturbed soil, broken branches, scattered acorns. Hunger drives innovation and observation alike. Careful eyes are as important as nimble hands. A light joke crosses your mind. If only acorns came labeled with nutritional info, life would be simpler. Humor remains a crucial mental buffer against relentless scarcity. You discover a small patch of frost-tolerant greens, their leaves curled against the cold. Kneeling carefully, you harvest enough to supplement your meager rations. The act is meditative, scraping soil, identifying edible plants, and avoiding toxic lookalikes. Fringe accounts suggest that some peasants would test unknown leaves on animals before human consumption. Historians still argue whether this method was common or anecdotal, but you can see the sense in caution, even if you are your own guinea pig. Returning to the village mid-morning, you observe subtle interactions among neighbors. Some quietly trade water for small amounts of herbs. Others share morsels of root stew. Hunger has transformed social behavior, making subtle communication, barter, and observation critical skills. You watch a young boy discreetly exchange a handful of moss for a slice of bread with an elder, both parties negotiating not only material needs, but trust. Historians still argue whether such barter networks were spontaneous or structured within village hierarchies, but the improvisation is palpable. As the day stretches on, you explore the concept of rationing more deliberately. You divide your roots, moss, and greens into small portions, measuring carefully to stretch sustenance across several meals. Each act is a strategic exercise. Too little today risks weakness. Too much risks depletion before the next day. Hunger teaches the balance of restraint and necessity. Fringe tales suggest that some villagers would coat a tiny portion of food with ashes to make it appear larger. A psychological tactic to comfort the hungry while preserving actual calories. Historians still argue whether this was commonly practiced or purely anecdotal. But the ingenuity speaks to the lengths humans will go to survive. By afternoon, you notice the subtle effects of scarcity on community morale. Conversations are quieter, movements slower, and yet there is a resilience threading through interactions. Small acts, sharing a spoonful of porridge, offering a tip on safe foraging, or merely lending a listening ear become vital. Hunger shapes empathy as much as it shapes necessity. You pause to observe a neighbor teaching a child to identify edible herbs, realizing that knowledge transfer is survival's hidden currency. The late afternoon brings a shift in focus. Firewood. You trudge to the edge of a nearby copse, gathering twigs, dead branches, and any flammable debris. Fires provide warmth, light, and a means to cook, yet fuel is scarce. You marvel at the careful choreography of villagers collecting, sharing, and conserving wood, noting how efficiency and observation are crucial. A quirky anecdote comes to mind. Some families supposedly burned old baskets or scraps of cloth when wood ran out. Historians still argue whether this was practical necessity or folklore, but the principle of using all available resources is clear. As evening approaches, you return home with your haul. The fire crackles weakly, illuminating the frost-dusted room. You boil a modest meal, moss, roots, and greens simmering together, releasing a faintly earthy aroma. Sitting cross-legged by the hearth, you reflect on the day's lessons: water management, foraging discipline, rationing, and resource conservation. Hunger has sharpened your attention to detail, your understanding of human behavior, and your appreciation for even the smallest comforts. Night descends quietly, with frost sparkling faintly outside. You lie on your straw mattress, belly modestly full, hands warmed by the fire, and mind tracing the rhythms of survival. Observation, ingenuity, patience, and shared knowledge. Hunger has transformed the mundane into acts of strategy and care. Sleep arrives slowly, carrying dreams flavored by moss, root stew, and a faint hope that careful attention, resourcefulness, and a touch of creativity will sustain you through the next day of scarcity and challenge. You awaken to the soft light of dawn spilling across frost-covered rooftops, the air biting at your cheeks, reminding you that every day is a negotiation with cold, hunger, and exhaustion. Today, your attention turns to energy conservation, how to preserve what little strength you have while still gathering food. tending to chores, and maintaining your vigilance in the village. Every movement must be deliberate, each decision weighed against its potential toll. Hunger has a way of teaching efficiency in the most uncompromising way. You begin with small tasks at home, checking stored roots, counting acorns, inspecting your modest supply of dried herbs. Even in the quiet of your own space, the discipline of measurement and allocation is vital. You realize that survival isn't merely about eating, it's about preserving energy to endure tomorrow, next week, and perhaps the long winter ahead. Fringe accounts mention that some peasants would divide their day into strict cycles of labor-rest and minimal foraging to maintain stamina. Historians still argue whether these schedules were widespread or idealized in later chronicles. But the principle resonates with your careful planning. Mid-morning brings a quiet venture into the nearby woods, not for quantity of food, but for strategic collection. You identify patches of roots, acorns, and frost-resistant greens, mindful to minimize effort while maximizing yield. Hunger sharpens your senses. You notice subtle tracks of small animals, disturbed soil indicating safe roots, and microclimates where edible plants survive frost. Observation is survival. Each small detail informs your next choice. You even discover a tiny spring-fed pool, its water clear and invigorating. A quirky anecdote surfaces. Villagers once believed that water from hidden pools could carry protective properties, boosting stamina. Historians still argue whether this was ritual or practical knowledge, but it reminds you that hope often travels alongside resourcefulness. Returning to the village, you note the patterns emerging among your neighbors. The same families you observed yesterday conserve energy, walking slowly, speaking quietly, and focusing on essential tasks. You recognize a rhythm of life, dictated less by preference and more by necessity. Hunger has reshaped movement, conversation, and attention, transforming the mundane into tactical action. Historians still argue whether famine primarily strengthens community cooperation or enforces isolation and vigilance. But your observations reveal a mixture of both tendencies. By noon, you assist a neighbor in sorting small caches of foraged food. Each acorn is counted, every leaf examined for safety. Even minor tasks are critical. Mismanagement of a single morsel could mean weakness, illness, or depletion of the next day's sustenance. You chuckle softly at the absurdity of precise accounting of moss and roots, but humor offers a small mental reprieve. Fringe accounts suggest that villagers would sometimes create intricate storage systems to ration food precisely, using layers of leaves and bark. Historians still argue whether such measures were practical or performative, but in your mind, the meticulous effort feels essential. The afternoon is devoted to observing and learning subtle social cues. You note how some villagers quietly barter small items or favors for extra rations. The conversation light but deliberate, each word weighed for consequence. Hunger has sharpened social intelligence as much as physical endurance. You watch a mother carefully portion her child's meal, exchanging glances with neighbors to communicate tacit agreements about fair sharing. Fringe tales describe villagers using silent gestures or marks to signal safe foraging zones to kin or allies. Historians still argue whether this was systematic or anecdotal, but you see the logic and the benefit of strategic communication in scarcity. Later, you focus on light chores, balancing physical exertion against fatigue. Sweeping paths, tending fires, and mending clothes are small but necessary acts. You notice that even the smallest movements must be intentional. Wasted energy could leave you too weak for evening foraging or survival tasks. Hunger enforces discipline, teaching lessons about pacing, conservation, and the importance of subtlety in every action. You smile faintly at a thought. I never imagined my energy budget would rival a royal accountant's. Humor provides a mental buffer against the relentless pressure of scarcity. As evening approaches, you gather a modest meal, combining a few boiled roots, moss, and tender greens from the woods. Each bite is chewed deliberately, a tactile meditation on resourcefulness and endurance. You notice the aroma of cooking filling the small home, comforting even in its simplicity. Hunger has transformed perception. Smells, textures, and warmth become essential sensory reinforcements of survival. Fringe accounts mention that villagers would sometimes mix herbs or bark to create a sense of satiety. Historians still argue whether this had genuine nutritional impact or was primarily psychological, but the idea resonates. Night descends quietly over the village, fires flickering in small cottages, smoke curling toward a clouded sky. The hush is punctuated by subtle whispers of planning, reassurance, and strategy. You sit near the hearth, reflecting on the day's lessons: energy conservation, strategic observation, social intelligence, and deliberate action. Hunger has become a comprehensive teacher, shaping body, mind, and spirit in ways ordinary life rarely requires. Lying on your straw mattress, you feel the gradual warmth of fatigue settling into your muscles. Your stomach, modestly full, reminds you of today's careful rationing and the small victories of successful foraging. You drift into a contemplative calm, the village around you breathing in quiet rhythm. Hunger may press insistently, but it also sharpens awareness, hones strategy, and fosters subtle bonds between those navigating scarcity together. Sleep arrives slowly, carrying reflections of observation, calculation, and the quiet resilience necessary to endure another day. The next morning, the world feels slightly different. Soft drizzle has begun to fall, the first rain in weeks. And though the sky remains gray and heavy, the sound of water dripping from thatched roofs feels like a kind of music. You step outside, tilting your head to catch the chill droplets on your face. The air smells of damp earth and wood smoke, and for a brief moment, the village seems alive again. Hunger may still clutch at your belly, but there's a quiet sense that something is shifting, something almost hopeful. You make your way toward the fields at the edge of the village. The soil once cracked and hard now darkens under the rain, softening into mud. You crouch down, running your fingers through it. It's still thin and tired, exhausted from seasons of overuse, but the moisture feels like a promise. You can almost imagine the seeds stirring below, waiting for the chance to wake. Historians still argue whether medieval villagers truly understood crop rotation or simply followed instinct and tradition. But you sense that every farmer here carries ancestral wisdom in their fingertips, knowledge born from watching the earth closely, year after difficult year. A few villagers gather nearby, talking quietly as they test the soil. They kneel, touch, smell, and exchange cautious smiles. One man jokes that the rain has arrived just in time to save his pride, if not his crops. You laugh softly, the sound blending with the patter of water. Humor feels easier today, like the village itself is exhaling. The rain continues into midday, gentle but steady. You decide to explore the fields further, your feet sinking into the softening ground. You notice how the landscape has changed. Empty furrows where grain once grew, patches of weeds reclaiming neglected plots, and fences sagging from neglect. Yet even amid decay, tiny green shoots push through. Life, stubborn and quiet, insists on returning. You pass by a woman kneeling beside a small garden plot, carefully clearing weeds. She hums under her breath, her voice low but steady. She explains that she's planting early barley, just a handful of seeds she de-saved through the winter, hidden from rats and desperate neighbors alike. The gesture feels both brave and fragile. You remember hearing stories about villagers who risk starvation by saving seed grain instead of eating it. Historians still argue whether this was widespread prudence or rare discipline, but seeing her, you understand the sacrifice. As the afternoon deepens, you help others clear a nearby field. Your muscles ache from the effort, but it feels different from the numb exhaustion of hunger. This work has purpose that looks forward rather than backward. You can sense a shared energy among the villagers, each movement synchronized by necessity and a flicker of hope. Mud sticks to your boots, rain seeps into your sleeves, but you keep going. Spurred by the rhythm of shovels and quiet conversation, a quirky anecdote resurfaces in your mind. Some peasants supposedly sang to their seeds, believing the warmth of human breath encouraged germination. Historians still argue whether this was literal practice or symbolic ritual. But as you hear the faint hum of voices around you, low melodies mixing with the raw, you find yourself half believing it. The sound feels like a prayer disguised as a work song. Later, you and a few others gather beneath the eaves of a barn to rest. The smell of damp straw fills the air. Someone passes around a small bowl of thin stew, the same blend of roots and herbs you've eaten for months, yet it tastes better today. Maybe it's the rain, or maybe it's the quiet companionship of shared labor. You smile faintly at a thought. Nothing seasons food like the hope of tomorrow. Evening settles in, and you walk home through puddles that mirror the last light of the setting sun. The drizzle has slowed to a mist, soft and cool on your face. The village feels subtly transformed, not by plenty, but by potential. You notice small things: smoke rising from hearths again, laughter drifting faintly through a half-open door, and a child chasing raindrops with an outstretched tongue. Hunger still lingers, but its sharp edges have dulled into something manageable. Something that might one day be just a memory. Back inside your cottage, you stir a pot of porridge thicker than usual, thanks to the shared effort of neighbors who pooled what they had left. The smell fills the small space, earthy and warm. You take a cautious sip, letting the heat spread through you. For the first time in many nights, you feel something close to contentment. You think of the fields beyond the village, the softened soil, the green shoots pushing upward through mud. Life is returning, not all at once, but inch by inch. You sit by the fire, reflecting on how famine changes people. It strips away excess, leaving only essentials: food, warmth, kindness, and the will to keep going. You recall the stories of plagues and pestilence that followed previous famines, the way hunger opened the door to sickness. Historians still argue whether disease was famine's cause or its consequence. But here in your small cottage, with the fire crackling and rain whispering outside, it hardly matters. All that matters is the moment, the warmth, the fullness, the fragile sense of peace. As night deepens, you hear the distant bells of the church tower ringing slowly, the sound echoing through mist. Once, those bells marked prayer or warning. Tonight, they sound almost like reassurance. You wrap yourself in your thin blanket, the fire casting soft shadows across the walls. Hunger may return, it always does, but for now, there is food, rain, and a sense of renewal. You drift toward sleep, mind tracing images of green fields, rain-soaked soil, and a horizon shimmering with faint light. The famine isn't over. Not yet, but the world is stirring again, and so are you. The earth, like the human spirit, refuses to stay barren forever. The rain finally ends 2 days later. The air feels washed clean, cool and bright in a way it hasn't in months. You step outside, stretching your back, and inhale the scent of wet thatch and damp soil. Birds have returned, tiny brown flashes, hopping between puddles, chirping like they'd been waiting for this exact moment. It's strange how even a sparrow can feel like a sign from heaven after so much gray silence. You smile to yourself, the corners of your mouth stiff from disuse, and whisper, well, maybe we're not doomed after all. The village hums with quiet energy. People are moving again, repairing fences, patching roofs, and mending tools long neglected through the hardest months. You join them, carrying what little strength you have left. The famine hasn't vanished overnight, but something inside everyone has shifted from despair to determination. You can almost hear it in the rhythm of footsteps on muddy paths, in the clatter of buckets, in the murmur of shared purpose. You spend the morning working beside a group of villagers you've come to know intimately through suffering. There's Agnes, whose laugh always sounds like a barked cough, and Tomas, who can repair anything with a bit of twine and stubbornness. Together, you patch a section of fence that borders the common field. As you hammer in the final stake, you feel a strange, steady pride. This small wooden barrier stands like a symbol of recovery. During a short break, you sit beneath a tree and share a crust of bread with the others. It's dry and thin, but the taste feels richer now that your stomach isn't so painfully empty. Tomas jokes that bread tastes better when you've nearly starved for it, and everyone laughs. You join in, even though it's grim humor. That's how survival works. You laugh when you can, because not laughing means thinking too much. A few hours later, the church bell rings again. This time, it's not for warning or death, it's for gathering. Father Aldred, the weary priest who somehow managed to stay alive through this whole ordeal, stands before the villagers with a hand raised for silence. His robes are patched, his face thin, but his eyes burn with the kind of conviction that only desperation can forge. He announces that it's time to give thanks to mark the coming of renewal. He's planning a small feast, not of plenty, but of remembrance. Each family will bring one thing, no matter how small, and together they'll make a meal to honor those lost and celebrate those who endured. Historians still argue whether such communal feasts were acts of faith or survival tactics, but right now it feels like both. You spend the rest of the day preparing for it. You find a handful of dried herbs and a bit of salt, precious commodities once hidden under a loose floorboard. Agnes brings a small onion. Tomas produces a thin slice of salted pork that somehow escaped the winter's hunger. Piece by piece, the villagers assemble their contributions, and by evening, the air fills with the smell of simmering stew. The feast takes place in the open square, beneath a sky streaked with violet clouds. The firelight flickers against faces that look both older and softer than before. You take your seat among them, wooden bowl in hand, and watch steam curl into the cool air. The stew is watery but fragrant, every ingredient carrying a story of sacrifice. You taste it slowly, savoring each bite like it's the finest meal you've ever had. The priest speaks of endurance and gratitude, his voice carrying through the gathering. He reminds everyone that famine comes and goes, but the bonds of the living hold fast. A quiet settles over the crowd. Some cry silently, others bow their heads. You glance up at the stars beginning to show through the clouds. They look the same as they did before the famine, but you feel different, older perhaps, but also more awake. A quirky historical tidbit comes to mind. Some chroniclers claim that after great famines, people's sense of taste changed, that hunger made them more sensitive to flavor, more reverent toward food. Historians still debate whether that's a poetic metaphor or an actual sensory shift, but as you sip your stew, you can believe it. Hunger has redefined every sensation. Even the simple taste of salt feels sacred. After the meal, the priest leads a small procession to the edge of the fields. Each person carries a candle or torch, their flickering light reflecting off puddles and wet earth. You follow, your steps slow and steady. At the field's edge, Father Aldred murmurs a blessing, asking the heavens for mercy, for fertile soil, and for gentle weather. You whisper your own silent prayer, though you're not sure who you're addressing: God, the earth, or simply the hope inside yourself. Then, one by one, villagers plant small tokens in the soil: a seed, a flower, a carved wooden charm. You press your own offering, a smooth stone from the riverbank, to the mud. It's not much, but it's yours, a symbol of survival and quiet defiance. The torches cast long shadows, and for a moment, the scene feels timeless, as though generations before and after are standing with you. Later, as the crowd disperses, you linger by the field. Fireflies flicker in the tall grass, and the smell of smoke drifts softly on the breeze. You think back on everything: the hunger, the cold, the quiet terror of watching neighbors fade away. It feels like a dream you barely escaped. Yet here you are, standing under a starlit sky, alive. You can't help but smile at the absurdity of it all. Survival, it turns out, is mostly stubbornness mixed with luck. As you walk home, you notice small signs of recovery everywhere: chickens scratching in the mud, children laughing near the well, A faint tune hummed from a nearby cottage. Even the dogs look livelier, their tails wagging as they scavenge around the square. The world, once gray and empty, has color again. It's faint, like the first blush of dawn, but it's there. Inside your cottage, you light a small tallow candle. Its weak flame flickers against the wall, but it's enough to cast a warm glow. You sit by the fire and run your hands over the rough grain of the table, feeling its solidity. You think about how far you've come, how hunger stripped away everything unnecessary and left behind only what mattered. You take one last bite of stew, now cold but comforting, and set the bowl aside. You lie down, pulling your blanket up to your chin, and close your eyes. Outside, the village is quiet. The wind rustles through the trees, carrying the scent of wet soil and faint wood smoke. You imagine the future, fields thick with grain, laughter echoing through the square, and long tables filled with bread and ale. You can almost taste it, the promise of plenty, of peace. It may not come tomorrow, or even next season, but it will come. The famine has left scars, but it has also carved strength. You've learned to endure, to adapt, to hope, even when hope felt foolish. And as you drift toward sleep, you realize that survival isn't just about food eats, about remembering that life, no matter how fragile, always leans toward light. Now, the candle gutters low. You listen to its faint hiss as it fades, and your breathing slows to match the rhythm of the wind outside. The story of the famine ends here, not with abundance, but with resilience. You made it through. So, as you lie there in the dark, picture yourself beneath that same quiet sky, no famine, no hunger, just the soft rustle of leaves and the hum of distant crickets. Your hands, once raw from work, rest easily now. The air feels gentle again, touched by the promise of morning. Let the last sounds of the medieval village fade away, the crackle of a dying fire, the faint bleat of a goat somewhere in the distance, the whisper of the wind weaving through open shutters. The world is calm now, and so are you. You've walked through hunger, fear, and loss, but you've also seen kindness, courage, and renewal. That's what makes stories like this worth telling, not the suffering, but the strength that rises out of it. So, breathe deeply and let the quiet settle in. The fields are green again, the rains have come, and tomorrow will bring another dawn. You're safe here, wrapped in the stillness of the past, watching it fade into the gentle hush of night. Good night, traveler of old times. Rest easy. You've survived the famine, and now, peace is all that remains.